What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Thank you for joining me for episode 14 of Season 1 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Season 1 is looking at deliberative mini-publics, and in today's episode I'm speaking with Didier Caluwaerts about the original G1000 in Belgium. Didier is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the VUB. His research interests include deliberative and participatory democracy, social, democratic and public sector innovation, social entrepreneurship, innovation management and cooperative governance. In last week's episode, I mentioned that this week we'd be hearing about the G1000 in Belgium and in the Netherlands. In the end, there was simply so much interesting material that I decided to split the Belgium and the Netherlands into 2 episodes. Can you explain how the G1000 in Belgium actually came about?
So the G1000 can be considered a child of war in the sense that it was conceived during a period of huge ethno-nationalist conflict and profound instability in Belgium. As you might know, following the general election, the Belgian general election held in June 2010, we had 541 days without a government, huge political instability, and we left behind countries like Cambodia, like Iraq. So the political climate at that time, in early 2011, in Belgium was very unstable. The public sphere was hugely polarized, and it's in this context of conflict and ethno-nationalist conflict that a number of people came together and they saw that there was a huge gap between the public agenda and the political agenda. There was a large discrepancy between the issues that the political elites were dealing with, which were mainly like state reform, constitutional change, language issues, very symbolic issues, and on the other hand, what citizens themselves consider to be the important issues. And one of the findings from Belgium, one of the most systematic findings we find in Belgium is that citizens are mostly concerned with jobs, with social security, with education, with immigration issues, whereas the elites are not dealing with those issues. So because of that gap, we thought, well, maybe we should do something. Maybe we should make sure that citizens are listened to, that their issues, their concerns are met. And that's basically why we organized the G1000. And the organizers of the G1000 were not politicians, but were citizens, ordinary citizens, writers, academics, business people. We gathered over 500 volunteers, and we thought, well, we should do something, and that's where the idea of the G1000 came from. And instead of asking money from governments in order to finance this citizens summit or this deliberative forum, we thought, well, if we want to put the issues on the agenda that citizens find important, well, we should find money ourselves. So we crowdfunded the entire budget, and over the course of about 6 months, we gathered around 500,000 euros, which is quite good for Belgium. We're just a small country, so
yes.
€500,000 in 6 months was pretty good.
Yeah, that's amazing. My understanding is that there was a country-wide process prior to the face-to-face meeting that was held in Brussels. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So the G1000 Citizens Summit, the mini-public itself, was only one of 3 phases. First, we had a large public consultation, then we had the Citizen Summit, and then afterwards we had a citizens panel. So the first phase, the country-wide process that you talk about, is a large phase of public consultation. And like I said, we didn't want to take issues from the political agenda. We wanted to see what citizens themselves consider to be important, to keep the agenda very open, well, extremely open even, to see what citizens themselves consider to be important. So 6 months before the actual Citizens Summit in Brussels, we launched an online idea box, which was open to all citizens. So anyone who had any concern, any issue they wanted to see discussed at the G1000 could go to the online platform, could submit their idea, present their issues, launch ideas that they consider to be important, and also they could rate other people's ideas. So in total, about 6,000 people launched their ideas or participated in this process. And in the end, we had 2,000 unique ideas. Those 2,000 ideas were then clustered into a top 25, and the top 25 was put online again so that people could say, well, I think that this or this issue is most important, so they could rate each of the 25 issues. And then in the end, we ended up with a top 3. And this top 3 was discussed at the G1000 itself. And these 3 issues were migration, social security, and financial regulation after the financial crisis. One of the problems we did have was we had a bit of a timing problem, in the sense that we launched this idea box and the top 25 and the top 3, but we only found out what the final 3 issues were a couple of weeks before the event. So that made it a bit difficult to organize or to write up information booklets and so on. So there's a bit of a trade-off. We had a very open process, but it took a while. So the G1000 itself scores a bit worse in terms of information and so on.
And could you briefly explain what happened because it was at the G1000, the face-to-face meeting was one day, wasn't it?
It was, yes. So the second phase was the G1000 Citizens Summit, which was a phase of public deliberation. We gathered 704 randomly selected citizens for one day to discuss each of these 3 issues. And then at the end of the day, they could pick one at random from the other list of the top 25. So during one day, these 704 people sat together. They deliberated, they listened to presentations from experts and so on. And each of the tables was moderated by a trained moderator, and we also had translators. Because, as you know, Belgium is a linguistically divided country, which meant that at these tables, well, we had people from different linguistic groups who didn't necessarily understand each other. So we also had a huge logistical problem in terms of translators. But in the end, we had translators at all of the bilingual or trilingual tables. And the G1000 process, the face-to-face process, was flanked by 2 other processes, which were the G-home and the G-offs. So we had 704 people in Brussels, but we also had G-homes. So we had like an online platform which live streamed the presentations from the experts and in which people could deliberate online. So we had 704 people in Brussels, but a huge amount of people outside of Brussels who also wanted to participate and who could do so through online media. And then there was the G-offs, which were yet another thing. What they were actually local discussion tables. So we had the Citizen Summit in Brussels, but all over the country, local organizers wanted to organize these kinds of discussions and deliberations themselves. So we said, well, we gave them a script, and they gathered people, and in total, a couple of hundreds of people all over Belgium discussed the same issues simultaneously with what was discussed in Brussels. So it was quite a public project. We had like a citizen summit in Brussels, but there were spin-offs all over Belgium.
How did you bring together the outputs of the discussions in the 3 different spheres?
So we had the discussions themselves, or the presentations in Brussels were live streamed.
Yes.
But then we made up templates for the outputs that were sent to the G-offs, the organizers of the G-offs, so the local tables themselves. They could fill out these templates and they could send them to Brussels, so they would be considered by the central desk in Brussels itself. So we took account of the outputs from the local tables as well. And then in our final report, we also analyzed the results of the G-home, so the online platform. We couldn't do that the day on on the 11th of November itself. But afterwards, the weeks after the G1000 Citizen Summit, we analyzed the online platform as well. So all of the inputs that were given to the G1000 were actually analyzed and taken up in the final report.
And then the third phase?
So that was the citizen panel. Like the second phase was a large citizens assembly, 704 people. But the results of that citizen assembly or of the citizen summit were very generic. If you discuss 3 issues on one day, you can't expect people to come up with very specific policy solutions. So in general, what we found was that the results were general principles, values that people consider to be important, but not so much very specific proposals. So that's why we decided, we need to take this one step further and we need to prepare effective policy proposals. So that's why we decided to have a third phase, which was the G32, which was a phase of policy preparation. So we took all the inputs of the G1000 Citizen Summit and we gathered 32 people during 3 weekends in order to translate these outputs and these values, the general principles, into specific policy proposals. And that's what they did during 3 weekends. So we had very open agenda setting, then a citizen summit which decided on the general principles, and then a phase of policy preparation in which policy proposals were thought of and written down.
And the people in the panel, they were from the G1000 face-to-face meeting, the summit?
Yeah. So the G1000 gathered 704 randomly selected citizens. And from those 704, we randomly selected 32, taking into account linguistic quota, which is always important in Belgium. And these 32 were gathered for 3 weekends. So it was like a stepwise process. So we had a very general random selection, and then from that random selection, we had another selection of the 32 people for the G32.
And the first selection for the 704, was that stratified to be demographically representative other than languages, like ages and so on, or was it more just whatever came up randomly?
We did use like population quota. So we made sure that, of course, in Belgium, because it was a very sensitive context, we needed to take into account the linguistic diversity. But we also made sure that a number of demographic quota were met. For instance, gender quota, quota in terms of age and province. So we made sure that people from all over the country were represented at the Citizen Summit. Because the event took place in Brussels, that would attract mostly people from Brussels. So we made sure that people from all over the country were represented, especially because there are some cultural differences even within a tiny little country such as Belgium. So it was important to us to make sure that the entire country was represented.
And the thing that I've realised that I've never asked anybody is why was it called G1000?
That was just coincidence. We were just brainstorming over a really cool name. So we thought, we want to gather 1,000 people. Let's call it the G1000. And at the time when we were brainstorming, a G20 meeting was taking place. So we thought, instead of having like the 20 richest countries in the world sitting together, maybe we should do like a G1000 with ordinary people, large group, a diverse group of people sitting together instead of just the rich and famous.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay. And what sort of response was there from politicians and others to the G1000 process and the outputs from the 3 phases?
So in the run-up to the G1000, we were treated with mild neglect. Some politicians were interested and they expressed their interest. Others didn't really care, and still others really didn't care. But there was a strong polarization between parties. Some parties in Belgium, like the Green Party and the Liberal Democratic Party, were in favor of the ideas behind the G1000, citizen deliberation, citizen participation, whereas other parties were more hesitant and they didn't know what to expect. They didn't know how it would turn out. So, the public sphere was very polarized, and the political parties were polarized or divided as well on whether this was a a good initiative. One thing I did notice is that we got a very strong nationalist headwind. Like I said, the G1000 took place in a climate of conflict, a climate of polarization, in which nationalist issues were central on the political agenda. And people from the Flemish Nationalist Party especially, they tried to discredit the G1000. Because we wanted to gather people from both linguistic groups, they labeled it as being a pro-Belgian event, which was not part of their agenda, which was not what they wanted to see. So they tried to discredit the G1000 as being pro-Belgian. At the G1000 itself, of course, being very polite, all the members all the presidents of all Belgian parliaments, and we have at least 7 of them, showed up to receive the outputs and to receive the final documents and so on and these suggestions. But they weren't very interested. They were being very polite, but for a while, for a couple of years, nothing really happened. So after G1000, there was some interest, and some political parties took the principles and the ideas of the G1000 to heart, but others simply disregarded them. And there was also a very strong polarization in the media as well. In general, the media were divided in the sense that the more progressive media thought that the G1000 was a very good idea, that it was very laudable. They liked the idea of citizen participation and citizen deliberation. But the more conservative media were very skeptical. And it was very clear in the days following the G1000 that there was this huge polarization in the sense that the conservative media didn't report on the outputs and the outcomes of the G1000. They didn't report on the process. They only reported on the things that went badly, like the fact that people had to wait for 20 minutes in order to get their food and that there weren't enough toilets. So they were very focused on, they wanted things not to go so well. And in the end, that's what they focused on. So there was some polarization within the media itself.
I suppose this is partly based on the fact that there were some academics involved in organising the G1000. I know there's been research undertaken looking at the process and what worked and what didn't, I guess. What are the key findings from that work?
So indeed, we gathered data on just about everything. We took surveys among politicians, among participants, among people who refused to participate. We took surveys among the general population on their opinions about the G1000. So we have a lot of data, and there's actually a book coming out next year, or in March 2018, on the G1000 in which we gather all of these data. But some of the key findings are, first of all, that, and this is quite surprising from a Belgian perspective, is that deliberation and democratic deliberation is possible even in contexts of deep conflict. And why is it considered to be important or interesting from a Belgian perspective? Well, it is because you have to understand the Belgian context. The Belgian political system functions on the premise that it's the elites who should find compromises and it's the citizens who should remain passive. We had one instance of citizen participation in a referendum in the early 1950s on the return of the king after the Second World War. And that very instance, that one instance of citizen participation almost blew up the country. So we were very cautious in promoting citizen participation in Belgium because of its deeply divided nature. So that's why it was very interesting for us to find that putting people together in a setting, in a deliberative setting, having them discuss highly polarizing issues, that was possible, that was feasible, and that things didn't necessarily explode, that people were able to listen to each other, to appreciate the arguments of the other side. And that was one of the main findings. That was one of the most promising findings of the G1000. And we applied this method and this design of the G1000 in a number of other countries as well, other deeply divided countries as well. And the results are systematically the same. Citizen deliberation is possible despite deep divisions, deep societal divisions. So that was the first finding. Deliberation is possible even in contexts of deep conflict. Secondly, that deliberation was possible even in context of multilingualism. That is also very important because deliberation is a model of democracy that relies very hard on talking. But in order to talk, you have to understand each other, and that's difficult in multilingual settings. So the G1000 was a test case for multilingual deliberation as well, and for the effects of interpreters and so on. And what we find is that even if there is kind of a mediation by translators and so on, it is possible in multilingual contexts to deliberate. And then one of the third findings is that deliberation, even in deeply divided societies such as Belgium, is able to bring about opinion change. What we did was we took a pre-test and a post-test survey. We compared these two surveys, and then what we found is that people actually become more respectful and more considerate and more appreciative of the arguments of the other side. That people, after talking to members of the other linguistic group, actually say that they value the other group to a much larger extent. So it leads to respect, it leads to intergroup deliberation, leads to intergroup appreciation, which was also a very, very interesting finding, because we thought, based on psychological research, we thought that there would be a huge bias, that people wouldn't believe what the other side was saying, that there would be cognitive dissonance reduction processes going on. But we didn't notice that. We found that respect grew, that appreciation grew, and that's always a nice finding.
Yes, it is. And one of the things you mentioned, which I'd like to know a little bit more about, is the research into why people didn't volunteer to participate, because that's often something we know very little about.
Mm-hmm. A colleague of mine at the University of Louvain-la-Neuve has done some research on it. And he distinguishes between two main factors. The first one is very practical. The G1000 started in Brussels at 9 o'clock in the morning. So people had to get there, and it took a lot of investment of time. People had to spend an entire day discussing issues, and they didn't really know how many people would show up and so on. So it's basically a matter of being properly motivated and being properly and being willing to make that time investment. So that's kind of the first reason why people don't participate, because it takes too much out of them, because the demands are too large. And then the other reason is that people might feel insecure in a deliberative setting, discussing issues such as migration and the financial crisis at a time of huge Belgian political crisis is very controversial. So it requires you to be able to formulate your arguments in a very good way and in a very argumentative, rational way. And some people just didn't feel up to the task of doing that. They feared that they would be ridiculed. So there are some psychological barriers to participating in these kinds of events, and those are the two main factors why people didn't participate.
That's interesting. I was speaking to Professor Jerry Stoker from Southampton University in the UK, and he was talking about research that he's done that suggests that a third to a half of people don't actually want to be politically involved and just think that the politicians should get on and do their job. Was there any sense of that sort of a group of people in regard to, choosing not to participate?
Yes, that's the traditional stealth democracy argument, that people aren't interested unless there is a huge crisis. Well, we did find some political apathy. People think, well, the politicians who cause the problems, maybe they should solve the problems as well. And people felt or at least some people felt like their opinions wouldn't be taken seriously by the political elite. And they thought, well, if that's the case, then we won't participate. So we did find some evidence for that. But what I mostly find, and I've done the G1000, but also a number of other projects on similar issues, on multiple levels, at local level, regional level, and so on. And what I find is that people are actually very willing to participate and to have a say on very controversial political issues. And that through participating, they actually become more engaged and that they actually become more motivated to participate in the future. So it's kind of participating in a deliberative mini-public functions like a school of democracy. You feel and you experience firsthand how difficult it is to make political decisions. And that's why your appreciation for the political process grows as well. So it's kind of a self-reinforcing effect. Through participating, people become more engaged and more committed to the political cause or the public cause. So that was also one of the findings of the G1000 and other spin-off projects.
Yes, and certainly I've found that myself in processes I've been involved in Australia, is that people do, not everybody, but a lot of them become more politically involved, not necessarily party political, but, more civic-minded, more interested in what's going on and being prepared to stand up about it and so on. What's been the longer-term impact of the process? I mean, I know that it's been used in other countries, but within Belgium itself, what's been the longer-term impact?
So to sketch the context once again, Belgium is a country that is not very fond of citizen participation because of the possible political destabilizing factors that citizen participation could involve. But we do notice some long-term impact. And we've looked at several impacts. We've looked at policies, on the impact of the G1000 on political parties, on society as a whole, and so on. So the overall policy impact of the G1000 was fairly limited. I have to be honest about that. The proposal that came out of the G1000 and the G32 didn't really make it into actual policies. But we do notice 5 years after the G1000 that there have been quite a number of parliamentary questions that mention the G1000, that explicitly mention some principles or some ideas that were launched at the G1000. Same goes for proposals of law. Some of the proposals of law that were submitted in the federal parliament actually mentioned the G1000 explicitly and the ideas that were launched at the G1000. So there is some policy impact, but it's fairly limited at the moment. And the reason for that is quite simple. Like I told in the beginning, we wanted to give citizens a say, and we explicitly chose not to involve politicians. We gathered the money ourselves. We set the agenda based on inputs from citizens. So in the end, the outputs that came out of the G1000 were crowdfunded or were crowdsourced. And the policymakers, they didn't feel compelled to listen to a grassroots initiative because of its very nature. So they said, well, this is a very interesting initiative, but we are not bound to do anything with those ideas. But we do notice, especially last 2 years, that there has been some kind of a trend in the sense that we have a lot of parliaments in Belgium, and most of those parliaments have actually set up some deliberative projects themselves. So they have organized mini-publics based on the principles of the G1000. And I've been a consultant for a couple of them. And the main reason why the presidents of the parliaments actually want to set these kinds of things up is because they were inspired by the principles and the ideas of the G1000. So it did set in motion a trend towards democratic innovations within parliaments themselves. But the overall policy impact of the G1000 and the exact outputs of the G1000 was fairly limited. So it took some time to mature, and these proposals took some 5 years to actually to have some impact. But we do notice that it's growing, and I think if we look back in another 5 years, that the impact of the G1000 on policies will be even larger. We also looked at the party political impact, and we thought, well, it's not sufficient to just look at policies, but also to look at what it did to parties. And we find, since the G1000 took place, that democratic innovation, that random selection, that lotocracy is actually mentioned in more party manifestos than ever before. At the moment, about 5 political parties in Flanders alone actually explicitly mention random selection, democratic innovation, mini-publics, and so on. So there has been some impact through parties, and especially the Green Party and Belgian or the Flemish Liberal Democratic Party directly refer to the G1000 in their manifestos. And also within those parties, several mini-publics have been set up in order to crowdsource party programs, in order to make sure that certain issues are introduced within the party framework and so on. So there has been some party political impact as well.
That's really interesting. So political parties are using randomly selected mini-publics to develop policy and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And to make sure that the policy ideas that they develop themselves have some legitimacy and have some resonance within the larger public. So they do regularly organize mini-publics to make sure that their own functioning, that their own internal functioning is improving as well. So that's actually a pretty good spin-off, a pretty good impact of the G1000.
Just to clarify, are they randomly selected from members of the political party or from the broader public to give feedback to the political party?
It depends on the party. So some parties have applied a mixed technique. So they selected randomly selected members from the party, but they also randomly selected part of the group from the population as a whole. And then there were other parties who said, well, we won't involve the larger public, but we just want to make sure that a diversity of our members is involved. So it's kind of a mixed strategy. Some parties want to involve the larger public. Others are mainly focused on their own members. But the trend towards deliberation, the trend towards more citizen involvement and or more diversity within party political structures I think is a pretty good trend.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We've got a lot of deliberative mini-publics happening in Australia and commissioned by governments, so the governments pay a lot more attention to the outputs, but we certainly haven't had anything happening within political parties or, at a party level, at a partisan level. Thank you for joining me to learn about the G1000 in Belgium. In next week's episode, I'll be speaking with Harm van Dijk about how the G1000 concept has been developed in the Netherlands. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.